Hello, welcome to Critical Thinking for the Rest of Us. Today's lecture, Exploring the Socratic Method. As promised, we today are going to dive into the Socratic Method, and we actually have a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to jump right in, and we're going to be looking specifically at two things. We're going to be looking at the different stages of the Socratic Method, and we're going to look at various ways of applying the Socratic Method in our lives. So importantly, I just want to point out that when I say stages of the Socratic Method, I'm not referring to what we talked about last time, where we discussed some of the key concepts or characteristics of the Socratic Method. This time we're looking at the stages. And so we're really looking at how the Socratic Method might unfold over time as you're having a conversation in that mode. So importantly, we identify four stages of the Socratic Method. And the four stages are the questioning stage, the clarification stage, the examination stage, and the evaluation stage. Now, I want to start by saying that these stages aren't necessarily something that happen in succession with no back and forth. And it's not necessarily the case that you don't achieve the Socratic Method if you miss one of these stages. What's important to keep in mind is that the Socratic Method is fluid. And so you may never get past the questioning stage, right? Just as a time constraint or in terms of intellectual capacity or bickering or whatnot. And it might be the case that you get quite far within the practice, and then you actually have to go backwards to the questioning and clarification stage. So just to stress that these stages are very fluid, and they can also be applied in specific instances in isolation. But really, the Socratic Method proper encompasses something like these four stages altogether. So the first stage of the Socratic Method is the questioning stage. Now, we've talked at length about what questioning is, specifically through the lens of critical thinking. But I can't stress enough how important a good question is. It's almost more important sometimes than a good answer. So remember, this is review, but remember that a good question for our purposes as critical thinkers is an open-ended question. And an open-ended question is a question that invites conversation and cooperation in coming up with an answer. So we want to juxtapose that with what a closed question is. And we might think of a closed question as essentially just asking a yes or no question, or really asking maybe even a rhetorical question, a kind of question that is not meant to foster conversation, and it's not meant to take anything forward from where you're at. It's not meant to expand your understanding. And then something that I mentioned as well that we want to avoid using are leading questions. Leading questions are fairly antithetical to the Socratic Method. They're often used in the education setting. They do serve a purpose. They do serve a purpose, but they don't have much of a place in the Socratic Method. So a leading question, of course, is a question that you ask when you're eliciting a specific response. So you already kind of know the answer, and you're just trying to rhetorically push or corner your conversation partner into giving the answer that you want them to give. We're not super interested in these kind of questions in this very specific method. So what is an open-ended question? A possible example of an open-ended question would be, of course, what is the good life, right? Or what is justice? These are very big questions. What is love? These are massive questions, and they're questions that everyone is going to probably define and come at and approach differently. And that's a good thing, right? That means you're making progress already. You've hit upon a good question. One of the questions we'll look at quite a bit in this example is justice. Actually, I'll come back to this idea, or what is justice, quite a few times today. But a good question is a question that, it really does elicit different responses or invites different approaches to defining the question and answering the question. So it's not one that's, predefined by your worldview. It's one that everyone can participate in. Something to keep in mind, too, about the questioning stage. The Socratic Method itself, obviously when you ask a question, you're looking for an answer. Oftentimes in the Socratic Method, you don't get an answer. So you'll actually end the conversation on all four stages not with an answer, but a clarified question. So really, sometimes this whole Socratic method is a sort of meta practice of clarifying stage one, which is getting clearer and clearer and clearer about the questions you're asking. Because obviously, when you say, what is justice? What is love? These are very broad questions. They're so broad that they're quite unwieldy. So I just wanted to stress that, is that you don't have to come up with an answer in order to have succeeded in the Socratic practice. The next stage is the clarification stage. Now, this stage is so important because it's really where you begin to define the key points and the definitions you're using in the conversation. So I made a joke earlier that if you don't define your terms when you're having a conversation, two people in a conversation can actually be having two different conversations because they're not talking about the same thing. So again, to return to the concept of justice, we all can fairly easily use that word, right? We're English speakers. We have a general sense of how to use it. And we can probably get away with, just generally using that word in everyday conversation. However, in a Socratic conversation, we really want to be as specific as possible with key terms and definitions. Remember, we don't take anything for granted. We're skeptics. We're healthy skeptics. We're charitable, but we're skeptic. And so we don't take anything for granted. And something like justice, we might have a general sense of what it is, but we can't take it for granted. Not in this mode. And so think of the clarification stage really is something that's very accepting. It's very inclusive. And why it's inclusive and accepting is that what you're really trying to stress is that everybody is on the same page with the conversation that you're having, and therefore everybody is able to participate. That's what the Socratic method is about. You don't have to agree with what people say, but the Socratic method is egalitarian in the sense that everyone is at least able to participate as best as they can. And one way of fostering participation in this specific instance is being clear on how the words you're using are being used. So, just to highlight an example of justice that actually comes from Plato in his dialogue, The Republic. They have a major conversation about what justice is in The Republic. If you've read it, you already know this. But there's a person in the dialogue named Glaucon, and he famously or notoriously defines justice as essentially something that arises from fear of punishment. So, justice is something like, first off, strong people get whatever they want, right? And that's just how the world works. And smaller people lose. But there's always retribution and backlash. And so justice sort of arises from fear of backlash. And so we let go of our strengths and our capacities to overcome others in order to maintain some equilibrium of some kind. But in this sense, Glaucon really defines justice in a negative sense, really. It's like a fear from backlash and punishment, and it's something that we endure. We endure justice. Or even he might say we suffer justice. Juxtapose this with Socrates, who's using this word in a completely different way. He defines justice as the harmony and the balance of the soul, specifically our appetitive, our desirous part of our soul, our spirited, emotional side of our soul, and then, of course, our rational soul. So he thinks what justice is balancing these three organs of the soul. And, of course, he'll go on to extrapolate how this reflects society and how we can see justice in the social setting by balancing these components and so on and so forth. But you can imagine for our purposes that, if you both define justice in these completely different ways, never clarify that and then have a conversation, you're not going to make a lot of progress, right? It's going to be a very difficult conversation. Something else that very well might happen at the clarification stage, and this is a good thing, is that you're realizing that you're hitting points in the conversation that you're not able to get past, or you're struggling perhaps to define something or to clarify a concept or an area of reasoning that you've reached. And that might feel like a setback or a roadblock, but really, view it as an opportunity. View it as a good thing, because you can't clarify things if you don't know what lacks clarification. So again, as I tried to stress here, the Socratic method is fluid. So it might very well be the case that, all right, well, we're going to bracket this. We don't quite agree on the exact nature of justice, but we found a little bit of common ground. What we're going to do now is move on, but we'll revisit this concept, or we'll revisit the definition. So the idea being here, of course, is that if you want to define the key terms or seek clarity within the conversation, you might have to look in different areas of the conversation and work in those areas before past areas become clearer. Of course, this is same for future stages of the conversation. So even just identifying points of struggle and impasses in a conversation is part of the clarification process. And of course, notice too, by going about the clarification process, what are you doing on a practical level, right? What's being achieved at the practical level, and what you're doing is you're reinforcing collaboration, right? And you're reinforcing collaboration because you're telling your partner here, like, hey, I want to have this conversation with you, a very laborious and active process of conversation. I want to have this conversation with you, but let's first start by getting our building blocks, bringing them together so that we can both participate equally or equitably. And so in that way, you're starting the whole thing off with cooperation. And that just fosters and opens up your mind. It makes it easier to have tough conversations when you both feel like you're equally able to contribute and to construct. Third stage, we move into examination. So this is really where we start to get into the critical thinking, into the logic. And so something I said in previous lectures in this sort of literary way, that Socrates didn't necessarily have an agenda. Sometimes it seemed like Socrates in his conversations would be leading you in a specific direction, and that might suggest that he's actually offering leading questions, not participating in the way that we want when we use the Socratic method. And I said that it might seem like Socrates is leading his opponents because there is one thing that he will not forego, and that's logical consistency. And so I said, again, very literarily, that he would sacrifice everyone's reasoning on the altar of logic, which just sounds cool. And I think it gives us a good sense of what he's up to here. And so in the examination stage, what we're really looking for, we've defined our terms, we've set our question out, we have a general direction we want to go in. But now as the conversation proceeds, is it proceeding logically? Is it proceeding consistently? And of course, are we, as we're having these conversations, are we avoiding fallacies, informal fallacies? We're going to get into those a little bit later. But are we relying on these very common, poor ways of thinking, or are we proceeding by staying consistent with our definitions, making logical inferences and so on? And so here, let me give you an example now of just a basic assumption that we might make. So, right, all conversations start with assumptions. Well, all arguments start with assumptions before we can get to conclusions. And so we might make the assumption that honesty is always good. And that generally seems to be true. It seems fairly uncontroversial. We tend to value honesty. We tend to value truth. How well we are at exercising that value, I think, is a worthwhile point of discussion. But nevertheless, we think that that's true. Honesty is always good. Well, as critical thinkers and as Socratics, we're going to scrutinize this. And it's sort of easy. It's an easy thing to scrutinize because the claim is that honesty is always good. So this is a very all or nothing claim. So it's either always the case or it fails. It's untrue. And these are often very easy claims to undermine because you literally only have to come up with one counterexample to undermine that claim. Because it's not a modest claim. It's a very universal claim. It's a very strong claim. And so we say, well, hold on, we've been making this assumption in the conversation that honesty is always good. But is it? Should we take that for granted? And, classically, we can come up with an example where being honest is not a good thing, right? So imagine you're going to go out to a party with a friend. He's come over and he asks you, he's like, hey, do I look good in my outfit? What's my appearance like? Like, am I on fire? Am I on fleek? Do I got it going on? And you're like, absolutely not. You're a very tall guy and you're wearing a t-shirt with a lot of vertical stripes on it, which just makes you look taller. So now you look like Gumby. I hope you feel great when you go to this party with me. All right, you've been very honest. You've done the thing, but you've absolutely offended your friend. You've undermined his confidence. You've made the whole night weird. And furthermore, in this specific instance, because, I'm controlling the example here, your friend has no recourse for change. So he has no clothes. He has no change of clothes. And so now he just goes out there and he feels weird. And what went wrong here? One, your friend, nervous, wasn't clear about his needs. What he really needed was some affirmation of like, man, we're going to go out there to this party and we're going to see our friends and people, and I'm feeling unconfident. Can you just give me a boost here? And, boo on you too for not, understanding where your friend is coming from and just kind of, sticking it to him there. So, example aside, jokes aside, this is a counterexample. We've demonstrated in certain circumstances that honesty is not always good. And so that undermines that claim. And so now we're going to have to, part of the examination process is we're going to have to, rework our preconceived notions that we came to the table with and adjust them for the conversation as it proceeds. And we'll have to make a more modest claim, something like honesty is often good. So see, that's a humbler claim. It makes space for alternatives here. And then finally, with the examination stage, looking at some of the practical benefit of engaging in the Socratic method at this stage is you're fostering something that is just really, really wonderful for everyone involved, and that is intellectual rigor. The Socratic method, as I said, is an active process. It's very taxing. It takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of energy. It's hard work. This isn't something that you're going to do casually. And then again, if you read Plato and his dialogues, which are our examples of the Socratic method in practice, you'll see that these conversations are very labor intensive. So, for instance, if you're reading the Symposium, the Symposium is actually a funny example because it's a major drinking party, and they basically get together and drink until the morning, and they're just obliterated. But the whole thing is a conversation. So they literally have probably been conversing for almost 12 hours. Of course, Socrates being the guy that he is, 7, 8 a.m. in the morning, he walks out. He doesn't stumble at all. He's just ready for the next conversation, right? But point being, the Socratic method is extremely intellectually rigorous. And by practicing it, you're really reinforcing and strengthening your intellectual capacities and strengthening it in the people that you're conversing with as well. So a really, really beautiful thing, especially in this day and age. Now we'll move on to the evaluation stage, which is the final stage of the Socratic method. So here, what you're really looking at this stage, you've been having your conversation, you've made a lot of progress, you've drawn some conclusions, you've also offered some solutions to the question, some potential answers. At this stage, what you're really looking for, when you're looking for a variety of things, is think about the impact of the conclusions that you're drawing. This can be a good litmus test or a good way of testing whether or not the conclusions that you've drawn are sound, or if they're ones that you're willing to accept or move forward with. So how are they going to impact me? How are they going to impact you, us? How are they going to impact our community? Whatever the setting and the question is, right? Look at the impact of the outcomes of your conversation as a way of casting it and putting it in contrast and determining whether or not it's something that you're willing to accept. So to give an example, to make what I just said a little bit clearer, thinking of educators, if we accept Glaucon's definition of justice and we think that justice is something like a consequence or something that we have to bear because we have to live in society and we don't get whatever we want unless we are willing to accept the backlash from it. Let's say we accept that versus Socrates' model of the balanced soul, right? So the balanced soul is one that brings apart the several organs of the psyche together into harmony so that we're acting and living and breathing in harmony here. We have these two different definitions of justice. There's good arguments for both. They're both very motivating, actually, and they both actually seem true when we start to reflect on the real world and how justice is used and thought of. But if I'm an educator and I'm looking at, well, what is the impact of these two forms of justice? We can begin to apply them. Like, do I want my students, is this what's best for my students, to be moving forward with the belief that justice is a compromise or justice is a burden? Even if there's good reasons for believing it, does it reach and foster the kind of outcomes that I want as an educator, versus trying to get my students to appreciate the fact that the balanced soul, justice is a balanced soul, where you're balancing your emotions and your drives with reason. This might be a little bit better for our students to take into the real world. And so one way of evaluating the conversation and its outcomes is looking at, well, what is the potential impact? Yeah. But that's one way to practically evaluate justice. And this highlights how important the evaluation stage is. Something to keep in mind as well, up at this point, this has been a very theoretical exercise. Often this is very intellectually heavy. And while, referring to the last lecture, we might use specific examples and we're focused on very, very specific question in a very specific setting, nevertheless, we're proceeding in a very heady kind of way. And so the evaluation stage is so important because it allows us to begin to at least theoretically apply it to practical circumstances. So we're trying to look at, well, how is this practically going to apply in my life, your life, students' lives, workers' lives, whatever it might be. And then finally here, the point that I want to conclude with the evaluation stage is, again, looking at the practical benefits of this stage. So what are you achieving? And by evaluating yourself, your beliefs, and all these things, what you're really doing is bringing yourself into self-harmony. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next step. Nevertheless, when you're doing evaluative work, what you're really doing is you're bringing your thinking into harmony with your actions and your practice as an individual, as someone that's situated in the world. We all have beliefs, we all have desires, and we all act on them. And so, by evaluating those beliefs and desires, we bring a sense of harmony. So those are the 4 stages of the Socratic method: questioning, clarification, examination, and evaluation. So there's various applications of the Socratic method. As you can imagine, you can put it in many domains of your life. I'm going to try to speak about a few of them. One of them, which is always important to me as a philosopher of ethics, is how does this apply to you in your personal life? Then we're going to look a little bit at in the workplace. How can you apply the Socratic method in the workplace? And so let's begin. All 4 of these stages of the Socratic method in these examples are going to apply. You can use them in each of them. And so if we just look at your personal life, you can ask yourself a lot of questions, right? Like hopefully you approach yourself with some level of curiosity and wonder and astonishment. You should be a curious object to yourself because you are a curious object, as a matter of fact. And so one question you might ask yourself, and one that I think is very important to ask yourself at least once in life, if not every year, every day, is what do I value? So this is a very important question because, as I said, we all value something. We all believe in something. Oftentimes, these values are given to us by our parents, by our religious upbringing, by our socio-political upbringing, etc. And we act on these values for better or for worse, or we violate our values. We work against our values for better or for worse. But nevertheless, we might ask ourselves, well, what do I value? This is a very important question to get clear on. It's also a very big question, right? So we need to move on now to the next stage and say, well, I recognize the importance of this. I think I understand the value of asking myself, what do I value? I don't know exactly how to go about doing that, how to go about evaluating what I value. And so, something very simple that you can do is just Google it. What are people's values? What are some things that people value? And you can get a list. If you need to start somewhere. You need some operative definitions. And so here are some values, right? Honesty, justice, integrity, philanthropy, and so on. And you can just list out some of these values. You might not be an expert on your values, but you can start there. And then you move on and define them, right? So what does honesty mean to me? Does it mean speaking the truth? Does it mean being true to the things that I believe. In that sense, this whole process is an act of honesty for yourself. But you go through and you define those values. You're not evaluating them now. You're not examining them yet. You're just getting clear on, well, what the heck do they mean before we jump in, or before I jump in my self-evaluative practice here. And so I get clear of like, what do I think justice is, or understand justice to be? Of course, too, the way you fill this out is already presupposing so much about the way you understand the world, and that's okay. You might realize you have a weird definition of justice, and you're like, okay, I'm going to dog ear that. I might have to come back to that because it was a little strange, and that's part of the process itself as well. Is it's open-ended and explorative, so you're always uncovering new things to wonder at and to think about, but. Clarification stage of this in your personal life is you just clarify what are some of the values. And then, of course, you start to evaluate or to examine and to evaluate these values and how you act in accordance with them or how you don't, right? Or if you have a particularly big decision you need to make and you're asking yourself, well, how does my possible decisions align with my values? Oftentimes when we make decisions that align with our values, even if they're hard, we're still able to do them. There's less resistance in that. In fact, oftentimes if you find yourself kind of stuck with choice paralysis and you're not able to move forward, you have some big decision, right? Should I move to Arizona, or should I stay in Nevada? Or I don't know, whatever it is. You have to reflect on, well, what do I value as a person? And then see how those choices line up with those values. Of course, too, what's going to crop up a lot in this process here is more basic assumptions. So you might be telling yourself, for instance, oh, there's a management position at work. Maybe I should take that up. One of the leading assumptions I might be making in this deliberative process is that I must make six figures or a lot of money to be successful. I'm not successful until I achieve X, whatever X might be. And then you might, in the process of actively deliberating, you might stop yourself, or hopefully stop yourself and say, hey, wait a minute, hold on. Where did this come from? Where did this idea come from that my worth and my success as an individual is predicated on the amount of money I make? I say this because I think many of us probably, if not consciously pursue this, we unconsciously pursue it or believe it or are told to believe it, that my worth and my success and as an individual is wrapped up in the amount of money I make. And I point this out, of course, too, because this is highly, highly socially reinforced. So I'm thinking specifically about the actor Val Kilmer. So he just passed away. Sorry if you didn't know that, but he just passed away recently. And I saw a news article, and the news article said, how much was Val Kilmer worth when he died? And I thought to myself, well, there it is right there. This is our confusion about what the good life is and what is important. Who cares how much Val Kilmer had? Who cares how much he left to his estate? That's not what matters. And that also is not what matters or likely mattered to him in the long run. I guess I shouldn't say that because I don't know the guy at all. But what mattered, or what marked his success as an individual, was his acting, and of course the impact and the beauty and the way he was able to move others through his craft, which is to act and to take on these characters and to portray them and to portray the human experience in a way that clarifies your experience, or you see yourself in it. Right? This is acting and art is a very high impact activities especially when you're good at them. And I would guess that Val Kilmer, if he could write the news articles for his death, probably wouldn't care too much about his net worth. I would bet $20 on this. But anyways, that made me a little sad. And so I thought I would try to throw this in there just to kind of poke at some of the social resistance we get to the conclusions we'll draw inevitably in the Socratic method, which is, for instance, if I want to take on this new job and I have this belief that I am not a good person until I'm making millions or billions of dollars, well, maybe I just have a false belief. And it might be a false belief that's steering me away from my values. So that's going to crop up in the process of examination as well. And then finally, very, very specific to this idea of evaluating your personal values is you've gotten clear on what the values are. You've gotten clear on how they stack up for you. And you've gotten clear on how you act in alignment with your values and how you act in disalignment with your values. So you've drawn some conclusions on things you would like to do or ways you would like to enact those values. the next thing you can do is actually just kind of do like a personal check-in. And so something that at least I know from personal experience is that when a person is clear on their values and they act in accordance with their values, they feel better. This just seems to be true. There's a lack of cognitive dissonance. There's a lack of stress. There's a lack of weight, and things just move more fluidly for us. And so a great way to end the Socratic process and evaluating your values, of course, is just asking yourself, well, how do I feel now having done this? Importantly, how do I imagine I would feel if I acted in certain ways that I believe would align me with justice or integrity or honesty? The idea being, of course, if you suddenly experience an increasing amount of stress and anxiety, maybe you need to go back to the clarification stage or the examination stage. Maybe something didn't quite work out and you have to go back to that piece that I said you had to bracket earlier. But nevertheless, at least in the personal setting, and at least related to this very specific question of values, check in with yourself. Check in with yourself and see if there's harmony of soul that you're experiencing. But let's move on now to the work life. So the Socratic method, of course, can be used in your work life as well. And one way that you might see that crop up is in, management, leadership, as well as project management. So if you're someone that's working on a lot of projects or, tasks, big tasks that have to be broken down into smaller components, the Socratic method is actually very helpful in this instance. A lot of work is outcome focused. So you're making a product or you're trying to come up with an outcome or you have some deliverables of some kind. And just given the way that the workplace is organized in that sense of like you work for an outcome of some kind and that outcome is taken up for more outcomes or whatever it might be, you can ask yourself, what am I asking? What are my questions? What are the things I want to know about my work? What is the things that I'm after in terms of solving? So you might ask, what is the problem that I want to solve? In the workplace, at least, when you're trying to come up with a solution to a problem, you're not going to make any progress if you're not as clear as possible on what the hell the problem is itself, right? So you have to get really clear on what the problem is before you can begin to imagine solutions for it. And so part of using the Socratic method as a project manager, as a leader, as a manager, and just as a worker in general is just getting clear on what are my tasks, what are the goals of my task, why am I being tasked with doing it, and of course, what are the possible solutions and how can I get as clear as possible of what these issues are? So the clearer I am, the more novel or the more precise I can be in my brainstorming and generating solutions. And then next, of course, moving into the examination and evaluation stage, not everything needs a novel solution. The human species has been around for a very long time. I think that work in general is a very fundamental part of the human experience. And we don't have to reinvent everything. We don't have to do it all over. Sometimes we need to just read a book or, look at someone else's solution and there it is. Meaning we can save time, resources, energy, money by simply realizing, I have a problem here that I'm trying to solve at my job, but it doesn't need a novel solution. I just need to look at people that have done it before. So if you have a box and you're trying to get it to go from point A to point B, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just look at how other people move things and you put some circular things on the box and then suddenly the box moves from point A to point B. Bam, done, right? Pretty cool. You didn't have to figure it out. You don't have to do the physics. You don't have to do any of the hard work. And so that's what I mean to suggest there. Of course, part of the examination evaluation phase is, actually, we need to come up with a novel solution to whatever problem it is in the workplace because it's very workplace specific, very us specific. And so we have to get clear now on so this is a problem generally, but now it's a problem for us. Why is it specifically a problem for us? What's unique about that? That will give you a hint of the direction you need to go for your novel solution. And then finally, to sum up with the evaluative stage of the Socratic method is, you've come up with a product, a solution, you've got a deliverable on hand of some kind. You can at least begin to theoretically imagine before you implement what are the consequences of this solution? What are the possible outcomes? What is the impact of the solution? How is this going to make my employees' work life better? How is this going to streamline my workflow so that I can focus on more important projects? How is this going to help my team work better together? And in doing that, even if, it seems like a good solution to whatever problem you have in the workplace, you still might get some clarification on, oh, actually, I imagine, if we implement this new strategy, there's going to be some friction with this team or something, and it's going to happen for these reasons. And you don't know that until you apply it, until you do the evaluative work. And so even if you ended up with the idea that, well, we still need to ship this, we still have this deliverable and it needs to go out, at least we can expect some friction from team B or whoever it might be. And so that's how you might apply the Socratic method in your personal life and how you might apply it in your workplace. But hopefully these very more focused and practical examples of personal life and workplace at least get the gears moving for you to take up the Socratic method and to create on your own. Now, the last thing I want to say about the Socratic method, it's a bit of a defense of philosophy in general, but it is also a defense of the Socratic method. Philosophy is very pie in the sky. It's very theoretical. It's very heady. It's very head in the clouds. These charges are not without foundation. They stick. Nevertheless, they do miss the practicality of philosophy, the practicality of the Socratic method, the practicality of critical thinking in general. So it's very cognitive. It's very mentally demanding. It's very heady. It's also extremely practical and it's something that you're going to be doing every day in your everyday life. So I want to stress that it's not merely a fun intellectual way of exhausting yourself. You're not just doing some crossword puzzles, right? You're putting in hard work. And I want to point out how. So if you imagine doing the Socratic method and you have this prejudice or this bias of yeah, this is cool. This is a very heady, fun thought experiment kind of thing. But also, I'm looking for practical ways of thinking more critically. Yes. All right. In some applications, the focus of the Socratic method is very theoretical in the way you go about it. But also recognize we've been talking at length about critical thinking and its various different components. So bear in mind all of the practical thinking skills, manifold practical thinking skills you're using in each of these stages of the Socratic method. This idea of, clarifying your thinking, reflecting, avoiding fallacies, all these things. You're very actively, very practically developing, rehearsing, reinforcing, and practicing these habits of thinking critically by engaging in the Socratic method. The Socratic method is really a massive conglomeration of very basic skills. What that means, of course, is that sometimes, you're not going to meet with success in the Socratic method, or it's not going to feel great if you're evaluating yourself or a friend or a parent or a student or not evaluating them, but having a conversation. It might not feel like you're making progress, but bear in mind all the things that you're practicing, the minutiae that you're practicing. It's extremely practical. So just by practicing the Socratic method, the benefits are it's infinite return, really. It makes all those various little pieces of your life that much easier when you're just simply trying to clarify a definition or challenge an assumption or seek understanding. That's that much easier because you've rehearsed it so much in such a demanding setting. So yes, philosophy, also very practical. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We're definitely masters of the Socratic method now. So I want to finish here by giving you a few reflection questions to get you out the door. So first question, which stage of the Socratic method, if any, do you feel you are most proficient at? Second, in what ways have you already leveraged the various stages of the Socratic method in the workplace or in your relationships with others? And then finally, how might you start implementing the Socratic method in your relationship with yourself? All right, so next time we're going to be addressing the elephant in the room, which is logic. We've sort of danced around this topic and even dipped our toe into it a little bit, but it's finally time to take it on head on. So we're going to be looking next time at logic, argumentation, and all of its pieces. So I'll see you next time. Thank you.